Hey guys, tonight we dive into something that will make your next haircut feel like a luxury spa treatment. We're talking about medieval barbers, and trust me, these weren't the friendly folks with striped poles and warm towels you know today. These were the most terrifying medical practitioners of their time, wielding razors not just for beards, but for amputations, bloodletting, and brain surgery. And here's the kicker. They were actually more dangerous than the university-trained physicians everyone feared. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in medieval Europe, maybe around 1300. You wake up with a throbbing toothache that feels like someone's driving a nail through your skull. Your options are limited. You could visit a university-trained physician, a learned man who spent years studying ancient texts in Latin, debating the balance of your four humours, and prescribing theoretical treatments based on Greek philosophy. Or you could walk down to the local barber shop where the same man who trimmed your hair yesterday is now sharpening a pair of iron pliers, ready to yank that tooth from your jaw with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and a 50-50 chance you'll bleed to death before sunset. Most people chose the barber, and that choice, more often than not, killed them. Welcome to the world of medieval barber surgeons, where a simple shave could end with an amputation, and where the line between grooming and grave digging was razor thin. These weren't just barbers who dabbled in medicine, they were the primary surgical practitioners of medieval Europe, performing everything from tooth extractions to battlefield amputations to drilling holes in people's skulls. And they did it all with the same tools they used to trim beards, with about as much medical training as your local hairdresser has today. Now you might be wondering, how did barbers become surgeons? The answer lies in one of history's most bizarre career pivots, orchestrated by the Catholic Church and cemented by papal decree. You see, in medieval times, most physicians were also clergy. Monks and priests were among the few people who could read and write, making them natural candidates for medical study. They ran hospitals, treated the sick, and performed minor surgeries as part of their religious duties. But in 1163, everything changed. The church issued an edict that would reshape medieval medicine forever. They declared that clergy could no longer perform bloodletting, stating that the church abhorred the procedure. Then, in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council went even further, forbidding all physicians, most of whom were clergy, from performing any surgical procedures. Contact with blood or bodily fluids was deemed contaminating to men of the church. Suddenly, surgery was orphaned. University-trained physicians, bound by religious law, could no longer touch their patients. They retreated to their academic towers, content to diagnose from a distance and prescribe treatments based on ancient texts. But people still needed surgery. Wounds still needed stitching. Teeth still needed pulling. Limbs still needed amputating. Enter the barbers. These craftsmen already possessed the essential tools of the trade: sharp blades, steady hands, and the stomach for blood. They worked in every town and village, serving monasteries where monks needed their tonsures maintained. When the church abandoned surgery, barbers simply expanded their services. Need a haircut? They had you covered. Need a tooth pulled? Same guy, same shop, same rusty tools. And thus began one of history's most terrifying medical experiments. Surgery, the most dangerous and invasive branch of medicine, was handed over to craftsmen with no formal medical training, no understanding of anatomy, and no concept of infection or sterilization. It would be like putting your local mechanic in charge of heart surgery, except the mechanic has never seen an engine manual and believes that all problems can be solved by hitting things with a hammer. The training system for medieval physicians versus barber surgeons reveals exactly why this arrangement was so catastrophically dangerous. University-trained physicians spent years in academic study. They were required to master the 7 classical liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. They studied translated texts, attributed to Hippocrates and Galen, memorizing ancient theories about the 4 humours and the balance of bodily fluids. At Montpellier's Faculty of Medicine, professors were required by 1309 to possess specific books by Galen, ensuring that students learned to reference ancient physicians as the ultimate source of medical knowledge. This education was entirely theoretical. Physicians learned to prove that ancient authorities were correct, not to question or innovate. They studied in Latin, debated abstract concepts, and rarely, if ever, touched an actual patient. Their knowledge was bookish, pristine, and utterly divorced from the messy reality of human anatomy. Barber surgeons, on the other hand, learned through apprenticeship. A young man interested in the trade would start by sweeping floors and sharpening razors. He'd watch his master work, first on beards, then on more complex procedures. There were no textbooks, no lectures, no examinations based on ancient wisdom. Instead, there was trial and error, mostly error, performed on living, breathing, screaming patients. A surgeon's apprenticeship typically began with shaving. The young apprentice could earn income, while slowly working up to more complex procedures. He learned to use a blade, not by studying diagrams, but by cutting into flesh. He learned anatomy, not from books, but by watching organs spill from opened bodies. He learned about blood loss, not from theory, but by watching patients die. This hands-on approach might sound more practical than academic study, but it was actually far more dangerous. Without understanding the underlying principles of anatomy, physiology, or disease, barber surgeons developed techniques through pure trial and error. They had no framework for understanding why procedures succeeded or failed. They couldn't predict complications or develop safer methods. They simply repeated what they'd seen work before, even if it worked by pure luck. The scope of procedures performed by medieval barber surgeons was absolutely staggering. These weren't just simple cuts and stitches. They performed amputations, tooth extractions, cataract surgery, kidney stone removal, and even brain surgery. They set broken bones, delivered babies, and treated battlefield wounds. They were, quite literally, the only surgical option available to most of medieval Europe. Bloodletting was their bread and butter, a procedure they performed daily based on the completely incorrect theory of the 4 humours. Medieval medicine believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in the body. Too much blood, time to drain some out. Feeling melancholy. That's excess black bile, better open a vein. This theory, largely unchanged since ancient Egypt, formed the basis of medieval medical practice. The tools of bloodletting were as varied as they were terrifying. Barber surgeons used lancets, small, sharp-pointed instruments often carried in ivory cases. They employed fleams, devices with multiple, variably sized blades that folded like a pocket knife. For more extensive bloodletting, they used scarificators, spring-loaded devices with 12 blades that rotated out simultaneously to create multiple puncture wounds. But perhaps most infamous were the leeches. Medieval barber surgeons used millions of these blood-sucking creatures annually. In the 1830s, France alone, Paris used 5 to 6 million leeches per year, with about 35 million used throughout the entire country. These weren't medical-grade leeches bred in sterile conditions. They were wild creatures pulled from ponds and swamps, carrying whatever diseases and parasites they'd picked up in their natural habitat. The process of bloodletting was both ritualistic and horrifying. The barber surgeon would examine the patient's urine, determining the specific imbalance based on its color, consistency, and taste. Yes, taste. Medieval practitioners actually tasted patients' urine as part of their diagnostic process. Based on this analysis, they would select the appropriate vein to open, the amount of blood to drain, and the method to use. For general bloodletting, they preferred the median cubital vein at the elbow, though any accessible vein would do. The patient would be seated or lying down, often gripping a pole to increase blood flow. The barber surgeon would make an incision with a lancet or fleam, allowing blood to flow into a bowl. The amount varied wildly, from a few ounces to several pints, depending on the practitioner's judgment and the patient's ability to remain conscious. Localized bloodletting involves scarification and cupping. The barber surgeon would scrape the skin with a cube-shaped brass box containing multiple small knives, creating numerous shallow cuts. Then they'd place a heated glass dome over the wounds, creating suction as the air cooled. This drew blood and other fluids to the surface, creating what they believed was a localized treatment for specific ailments. The results were predictably catastrophic. Bloodletting was prescribed for virtually everything: acne, asthma, cancer, cholera, coma, convulsions, diabetes, epilepsy, gangrene, gout, herpes, indigestion, insanity, jaundice, leprosy, pneumonia, plague, smallpox, stroke, tuberculosis, and about 100 other conditions. This universal application of a dangerous and ineffective treatment demonstrates the complete lack of medical understanding among barber surgeons. The biggest risk wasn't just ineffectiveness, it was death. Patients regularly died from blood loss during treatment. Others succumbed to infections introduced by unsterilized instruments shared between patients. The practice was so dangerous that many patients died not from their original ailments, but from the treatment itself. George Washington provides perhaps the most famous example of bloodletting's lethal potential. In December 1799, the first president of the United States fell ill with what was likely a throat infection. Upon his request, his doctors bled him 4 times over 8 hours, removing 40% of his blood. Washington died that same day, almost certainly killed by the treatment rather than the disease. But bloodletting was just the beginning of the barber surgeon's repertoire. When infection set in, when wounds festered, when diseases progressed beyond the reach of leeches and lancets, these medieval practitioners turned to more extreme measures. And that's where things got truly terrifying. Amputation was one of their most common procedures, performed with disturbing frequency during times of war and epidemic. Medieval Europe was plagued by ergotism, a condition caused by eating bread contaminated with ergot fungus. This poisoning led to gangrene of the extremities, requiring immediate amputation to save the patient's life. Initially, monks performed these procedures, but after the 1215 papal decree, the task fell to barber surgeons. The amputation process was brutally simple and horrifyingly painful. There was no effective anesthesia. Some practitioners used natural substances like mandrake root or opium, but these were largely ineffective and sometimes more dangerous than the surgery itself. Most patients were simply tied to the operating table, often losing consciousness from shock during the procedure. An experienced barber surgeon could complete an amputation in as little as 3 minutes. This wasn't a mark of skill, but of necessity. Patients frequently died from shock and blood loss during prolonged procedures. Speed was the only anesthetic available. The process itself was primitive beyond belief. The barber surgeon would expose the bone, have an assistant pull back the flesh, and then use a bone saw to cut straight through. They kept spare saws on hand because the first one often broke during the procedure. After cutting through the bone, they'd cauterize the wound with red-hot iron, sealing blood vessels and tissue with burning metal. The screams could be heard throughout the town. Even more terrifying was trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in patients' skulls. This procedure was performed to treat seizures, skull fractures, behavioral problems, and various mental conditions. Early practitioners believed that drilling a hole in the skull would allow demons and evil spirits to escape. Later theories suggested it relieved pressure on the brain. The tools were primitive: flint, obsidian, or stone knives in earlier periods, later replaced by bronze and copper implements. The patient remained fully conscious throughout the procedure, held down by assistants while the barber surgeons slowly bored through their skull with primitive tools. Many patients died from brain damage, infection, or shock. Those who survived often suffered permanent neurological damage. Archaeological evidence shows that some patients actually survived trepanation, with skulls showing signs of healing around the drill holes. This suggests that some barber surgeons developed techniques that occasionally worked, though whether through skill or luck remains unclear. The survival rate was low enough that attempting the procedure was essentially a death sentence. Tooth extraction was another staple of barber surgery, though far more dangerous than modern dental work. Medieval people suffered from terrible dental problems due to poor nutrition and complete lack of oral hygiene. Teeth rotted, abscesses formed, and infections spread through the jaw and into the brain. The barber surgeon's solution was simple: yank out the offending tooth with iron pliers or forceps. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and no understanding of infection control. The same tools used on multiple patients spread disease from mouth to mouth. Infections were common, often proving fatal as bacteria spread through the bloodstream. The social position of barber surgeons reflected society's ambivalent attitude toward their work. They were essential, yet despised, necessary, yet feared. Anyone who worked with blood, including butchers and executioners, was considered socially tainted. They couldn't be regarded as fully honorable, regardless of their skill or success rate. This social stigma was well deserved. Barber surgeons had catastrophically high failure rates. Their treatments were more likely to kill than cure. Their tools spread disease. Their techniques were based on superstition rather than science. They were, quite literally, more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to treat. And yet, they were also the only option available to most people. University-trained physicians were expensive, rare, and forbidden from performing surgery. For the common person suffering from injury or illness, the local barber surgeon represented the only hope of treatment, however slim that hope might be. The guild system that governed barber surgeons provided some organization but little quality control. In 1571, barbers organized into professional guilds that regulated training, jobs, pay, and the number of practitioners. These guilds maintained standards and oversaw apprenticeships, but their standards were based on traditional practices rather than medical effectiveness. Guild examinations tested apprentices on their ability to perform established procedures, not on their understanding of anatomy or their success rates. A candidate who could quickly amputate a limb or efficiently drain blood would pass, regardless of whether these procedures actually helped patients. The guild system perpetuated dangerous practices by codifying them as professional standards. Despite their terrible reputation and high failure rates, some barber surgeons did make genuine contributions to medical knowledge. Ambroise Paré, widely regarded as the father of modern surgery, emerged from the barber surgeon tradition. Starting as an apprentice at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, he learned anatomy and surgery through hands-on experience before becoming an army surgeon and eventually surgeon to the king. Paré revolutionized surgical practice by abandoning many traditional techniques. Instead of using boiling oil and cauterization for war wounds, he developed an ointment of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. He introduced the practice of ligating arteries instead of cauterizing them during amputation. He invented scientific instruments, popularized the use of trusses for hernias, and was among the first to suggest syphilis as a cause of aneurysm. It was said that Paré was worth 10,000 soldiers on the battlefield because men knew their chances of survival were greatest if he was present. However, Such exceptional practitioners were extremely rare. Most barber surgeons continued using traditional methods throughout the medieval period, maintaining their reputation as harbingers of death rather than healers. The lasting legacy of medieval barber surgeons can still be seen today in the familiar red and white striped barber pole. This symbol directly represents their bloody history. The red stripe symbolizes blood. The white represents bandages or tourniquets. The pole itself mimics the stick that patients gripped during bloodletting to increase blood flow. Every time you see a barber pole, you're looking at a monument to one of history's most dangerous medical practices. But the real legacy of medieval barber surgeons isn't found in symbols or historical curiosities. It's found in the fundamental lesson they teach us about the dangers of combining ignorance with authority, of performing complex procedures without understanding, of prioritizing tradition over evidence. These weren't evil men seeking to harm their patients. They were craftsmen doing their best with the knowledge and tools available to them. They believed in their methods, trusted their training, and genuinely sought to help the sick and injured. Their failure wasn't one of intention, but of understanding. The medieval barber surgeon represents a cautionary tale about what happens when medical practice becomes separated from medical knowledge, when procedures are performed based on tradition rather than evidence, when the most dangerous aspects of healthcare are left to the least qualified practitioners. In our modern world, where we benefit from scientific medicine, sterile instruments, and evidence-based treatments, it's easy to look back at medieval barber surgeons with a mixture of horror and amusement. But their story serves as a reminder of how precious and fragile medical knowledge truly is, and how quickly healing can turn to harm when ignorance wields the surgeon's blade. The terror inspired by medieval barber surgeons wasn't superstition or prejudice. It was entirely rational fear based on overwhelming evidence that these practitioners were more likely to kill than cure. Their reputation as the scariest medical practitioners of their time was well earned through centuries of botched procedures, unnecessary deaths, and treatments that were worse than the diseases they claimed to cure. And this was just the beginning of their terrifying story. When medieval barber surgeons weren't busy drilling holes in skulls or sawing through bones, they turned their attention to one of their most lucrative and frequent procedures, battlefield medicine. And if you thought their peacetime practices were horrifying, wait until you see what they did when armies started marching and swords started swinging. Picture this scene. It's 1346, and you're a soldier at the Battle of Crecy. An English longbow arrow has just punched through your chainmail and embedded itself deep in your shoulder. The pain is excruciating. Blood is pouring down your arm, and you can feel consciousness slipping away. Your fellow soldiers drag you to the medical tent, where a barber surgeon awaits with his collection of iron tools, a bucket of questionable water, and absolutely no understanding of what we now call shock, infection, or proper wound care. Your treatment begins immediately. No time for assessment, no careful examination. The barber surgeon grabs a pair of iron forceps and begins digging into your wound, searching for the arrowhead. He's working by feel, probing deeper and deeper into muscle and tissue. There's no anesthesia, of course. Your screams mix with those of dozens of other wounded men as the surgeon finally locates the metal point and begins yanking it free, tearing through whatever healthy tissue remains. But extracting the arrow is only the beginning of your ordeal. Medieval warfare introduced new types of wounds that barber surgeons had never encountered before. Crossbow bolts created deep puncture wounds. Maces and war hammers crushed bones into fragments. Most terrifying of all were the early firearms, primitive guns that fired lead balls at devastating velocity. Gunshot wounds presented unique challenges that medieval barber surgeons were utterly unprepared to handle. The lead bullets didn't just create holes, they carried fabric, dirt, and debris deep into the body. They shattered bones and created massive internal damage that was impossible to see or understand. When faced with a gunshot wound, the standard procedure was simple and brutal. Dig out the bullet with whatever tools were available, cauterize the wound with red-hot iron, and hope for the best. The bullet extraction process was a nightmare of medieval medicine. Using crude forceps or even makeshift tools, the barber surgeon would probe deep into the wound, often causing more damage than the original bullet. They had no understanding of trajectory, no knowledge of anatomy beyond what they could see with their eyes. They would dig and probe until they either found the bullet or the patient died from blood loss. Once the bullet was extracted, assuming the patient survived that long, came the cauterization. Red-hot iron brands were pressed directly onto the open wound, sealing blood vessels and tissue with burning metal. The smell of cooking flesh filled the air as patients screamed and convulsed. This wasn't just torture, it was considered cutting-edge medical treatment. The survival rate for gunshot wounds treated by medieval barber surgeons was catastrophically low. Most patients died not from the original injury, but from the treatment itself. Blood loss, shock, and infection claimed victim after victim, while the barber surgeons continued using the same failed techniques, convinced that their methods were sound. Battlefield amputations were even more horrific than their civilian counterparts. Speed was everything, because wounded soldiers kept arriving, and there was no time for careful procedure. A barber surgeon might perform dozens of amputations in a single day, using the same unwashed tools on patient after patient. The process was streamlined for efficiency, not survival. Soldiers would be laid on rough wooden tables, often just planks balanced on barrels. Assistants would hold down the patient while the barber surgeon went to work with his bone saw. The entire procedure, from first cut to final cauterization, might take less than 5 minutes. Those who survived the initial shock often died days later from infection or blood poisoning. What made battlefield medicine even more dangerous was the complete absence of any understanding about wound care or infection. Barber surgeons would move from patient to patient without washing their hands or cleaning their instruments. Blood from previous patients contaminated every tool, every bandage, every surface in the medical tent. Gangrene was rampant on medieval battlefields, turning minor wounds into death sentences. Barber surgeons had no understanding of what caused the blackening, rotting flesh that spread from wound sites. Their solution was always the same: cut off the affected area and cauterize what remained. This led to a horrific cycle where soldiers who might have survived with proper wound care instead faced amputation after amputation as infection spread. The medieval understanding of infection was not just wrong, it was dangerously backwards. They believed that pus formation was a good sign, indicating that the body was healing properly. They actually encouraged the development of what they called laudable pus, thinking it was drawing poison from the wound. In reality, they were celebrating the very infections that were killing their patients. Wound dressing was equally primitive and harmful. Barber surgeons would pack wounds with whatever materials were available: old cloth, moss, animal hair, or even spider webs. These materials, far from being sterile, were crawling with bacteria and parasites. They would leave these dressings in place for days or weeks, allowing infections to fester beneath layers of rotting fabric. The psychological trauma inflicted by barber surgeons was almost as devastating as their physical interventions. Soldiers knew that being wounded meant facing procedures that were often worse than death. Many chose to hide their injuries rather than submit to treatment, preferring to take their chances with infection rather than face the surgeon's blade. The reputation of battlefield barber surgeons spread terror through medieval armies. Experienced soldiers would tell new recruits horrific stories of comrades who had died screaming under the surgeon's knife, of amputations performed without cause, of men who went into the medical tent with minor wounds, and came out as corpses. This fear wasn't superstition or cowardice. It was rational terror based on overwhelming evidence that the cure was worse than the disease. Military records from the period show that wounded soldiers treated by barber surgeons had lower survival rates than those who received no treatment at all. Yet these same barber surgeons were considered essential to military operations. Every army had to have them, not because they saved lives, but because they provided the illusion of medical care. Commanders believed that having surgeons present would boost morale, even though the reality was quite the opposite. The tools of battlefield surgery were designed for speed and portability, not precision or safety. A military barber surgeon's kit might include a bone saw, several knives of different sizes, forceps, a cauterizing iron, and various hooks and probes. These tools were often made by local blacksmiths using whatever metal was available. They were crude, poorly balanced, and impossible to keep clean in battlefield conditions. Sterilization was not just unknown, it was considered unnecessary. Barber surgeons might rinse their tools in water between patients, but more often they simply wiped them on their already blood-soaked aprons. The same instruments that had just been used to amputate a gangrenous limb would be used moments later on a fresh wound, spreading infection from patient to patient. The speed required for battlefield surgery led to shortcuts that would be horrifying, even by medieval standards. Barber surgeons would often amputate limbs that could have been saved simply because amputation was faster than attempting repair. A broken arm might be sawed off rather than set. A deep cut might result in the loss of an entire hand. These decisions weren't based on medical necessity, but on the pressure to move quickly through the endless line of wounded soldiers. Each patient represented a few minutes of the surgeon's time, regardless of whether the treatment was appropriate or likely to succeed. The aftermath of medieval battles was a scene from hell, with medical tents filled with screaming men, blood-soaked surgeons working by flickering candlelight, and piles of amputated limbs growing higher by the hour. The air was thick with the smell of blood, burned flesh, and human waste. Assistants would drag away the dead to make room for the next wave of wounded. Many soldiers who survived the initial surgery died in the days that followed, succumbing to infections that spread through the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of military camps. There was no concept of post-operative care, no understanding of the need for clean bedding or proper nutrition. Wounded soldiers were simply laid on straw pallets and left to recover or die on their own. The psychological impact of witnessing these medical horrors affected entire armies. Soldiers who had seen their comrades butchered by incompetent surgeons often chose to desert rather than risk facing similar treatment. The terror inspired by military barber surgeons became a significant factor in medieval warfare, sometimes affecting the outcome of entire campaigns. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of battlefield barber surgery was how routine it became. These weren't emergency procedures performed in desperate circumstances. They were standard operating procedure, carried out with the same casual efficiency that modern soldiers might use to clean their weapons. Barber surgeons developed a professional detachment that allowed them to saw through bone and burn flesh, without apparent emotion. They had to, in order to function in an environment where human suffering was measured not in individual tragedies, but in pounds of amputated limbs and buckets of drained blood. This detachment extended to their view of patients as well. Wounded soldiers weren't individuals with hopes and fears. They were problems to be solved as quickly as possible. The barber surgeon's job wasn't to heal or comfort, it was to process wounded men through his station so the army could continue functioning. The training that military barber surgeons received was even more abbreviated than their civilian counterparts. Young men might be pressed into service with just days or weeks of instruction, learning their trade on the bodies of dying soldiers. They were taught to cut fast, cauterize thoroughly, and move on to the next patient without looking back. This system of battlefield medical training created a cycle of incompetence that perpetuated itself through generations of warfare. Each new conflict produced a fresh crop of undertrained surgeons who learned their techniques from equally undertrained predecessors, ensuring that medical knowledge never advanced beyond the most primitive level. The horror of medieval battlefield medicine wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the inevitable result of a system that valued speed over skill, tradition over innovation, and convenience over competence. When the most dangerous medical procedures were handed over to the least qualified practitioners under the most stressful conditions imaginable, the results were predictably catastrophic. And yet this was just one aspect of the barber surgeon's terrifying repertoire. Away from the battlefield, in the quiet workshops and market squares of medieval towns, these same practitioners were developing even more creative ways to terrorize their patients. Because when you combine surgical tools with complete ignorance of human anatomy, the possibilities for medical mayhem are truly endless. The everyday horrors of civilian barber surgery were in many ways worse than battlefield medicine, because they were performed on healthy people who had the misfortune to seek treatment for minor ailments. A simple toothache could become a death sentence, a small cut could lead to amputation, and through it all, the barber surgeons continued their grisly work, convinced that they were healers rather than harbingers of death. The most terrifying thing about civilian barber surgery wasn't the dramatic battlefield amputations or the emergency procedures performed under desperate circumstances. It was the routine, everyday horror of ordinary people walking into a barber shop with minor problems and walking out as corpses. Or worse, not walking out at all. Consider the case of a simple dental problem. You're a merchant in 14th century London, and you've got a nagging tooth that's been bothering you for weeks. It throbs when you eat, aches when you sleep, and you're starting to develop a fever. You know you need help, so you make your way to the local barber surgeon's shop. The shop itself is a study in medieval multitasking. In one corner, a customer sits getting his beard trimmed while humming contentedly. In another corner, a man screams as the same barber surgeon extracts a tooth with iron pliers. Blood spatters the floor, mixing with hair clippings, and God knows what else. The tools used for your haircut this morning will be used for surgery this afternoon, with maybe a quick rinse in between if you're lucky. When your turn comes, you're instructed to sit on a wooden stool and grip the arms tightly. The barber surgeon examines your mouth with the same hands he just used to trim someone's hair, probing the infected tooth with a finger that's been places you don't want to think about. His diagnosis is swift and confident. The tooth must come out. There's no anesthesia, of course, no numbing agents, no pain relief of any kind. The barber surgeon simply grabs a pair of iron forceps, positions them around your tooth, and begins pulling. But medieval dental forceps weren't precision instruments. They were crude iron tools, often made by local blacksmiths, who had never seen the inside of a human mouth. The extraction process is a nightmare of medieval medicine. The forceps slip, crushing healthy teeth on either side of the infected one. The barber surgeon adjusts his grip and pulls harder, causing the tooth to break off at the root. Now he has to dig into your gums with a sharp probe, trying to extract the remaining fragments while blood pours down your throat. Minutes pass, or maybe hours. It's impossible to tell through the haze of agony. Finally, the barber surgeon declares victory, holding up the shattered remains of your tooth like a trophy. But your ordeal is far from over. The gaping wound in your mouth is now exposed to whatever bacteria and filth inhabit his workspace. There's no antiseptic, no stitches, no proper wound care. You're given a rag to bite down on and told to go home and rest. Within days, infection sets in. Your jaw swells, fever spikes, and you begin to understand why so many people die from dental work. The infection spreads through your bloodstream, and within a week, you're dead from what should have been a routine tooth extraction. This wasn't an unusual outcome. Medieval dental surgery had a mortality rate that would shock modern practitioners. Simple extractions regularly killed patients through blood loss, infection, or shock. Yet people continued to seek treatment because the alternative, living with dental pain in an age without painkillers, was often unbearable. But dental work was just the beginning of the civilian barber surgeons' repertoire of terror. They also specialized in treating eye problems, a field of medicine that required precision, sterility, and deep understanding of anatomy. Medieval barber surgeons possessed none of these qualities. Cataract surgery was one of their most ambitious procedures, involving the attempted removal of clouded lenses from patients' eyes. The technique, if you can call it that, involved inserting a sharp needle through the cornea and attempting to dislodge the cataract by poking and prodding inside the eye. The patient would be held down by assistants, while the barber surgeon worked with a crude needle, often made from iron or bronze. There was no magnification, no proper lighting, no understanding of eye anatomy. The surgeons simply stabbed into the eye and hoped for the best. Most patients ended up completely blind. The lucky ones only lost sight in the operated eye. The unlucky ones died from brain infections when the crude instruments punctured too deeply, allowing bacteria to enter the skull through the eye socket. Kidney stone removal was another specialty that showcased the barber surgeon's combination of ambition and incompetence. These procedures involved cutting into the patient's perineum and attempting to extract stones from the bladder using long, hooked instruments. The mortality rate for kidney stone surgery approached 100%. Patients died from blood loss, shock, infection, or damage to internal organs. Yet the procedure continued to be performed because kidney stones caused such excruciating pain that patients were willing to risk almost certain death for the chance of relief. The tools used for these procedures were works of medieval craftsmanship in their own terrifying way. Kidney stone extractors were long, curved instruments with sharp hooks on the end, designed to snag stones and pull them through incisions. They looked more like torture devices than medical instruments, and functionally, there was little difference. Perhaps most horrifying of all were the gynecological procedures performed by barber surgeons. Medieval women faced unique medical challenges related to childbirth and reproductive health, and barber surgeons approached these problems with their characteristic combination of confidence and ignorance. Difficult childbirths often required surgical intervention, but barber surgeons had no understanding of obstetrics, anatomy, or the delicate nature of the birthing process. Their solution to breech births or other complications was typically to use crude instruments to forcibly extract the baby, often resulting in the death of both mother and child. The instruments used for these procedures were primitive beyond belief. Medieval obstetric forceps were essentially iron tongs designed to grip and pull rather than to gently guide. They caused massive trauma to both mother and baby, often crushing the infant's skull or tearing the mother's reproductive organs beyond repair. Caesarean sections were attempted occasionally, but with predictably catastrophic results. The procedure involved cutting through the abdominal wall and uterus with the same knives used for other surgeries. There was no understanding of sterile technique, no knowledge of proper suturing, no concept of post-operative care. The mortality rate for caesarean sections approached 100%. The few women who survived the initial surgery almost invariably died from infection within days. Yet the procedure continued to be attempted, because sometimes it was the only way to save the baby's life, even if the mother was doomed. Medieval barber surgeons also treated hernias, a common problem in an age of heavy manual labor. Their approach was characteristically direct and dangerous. They would cut open the affected area, push the protruding organs back into place, and attempt to repair the muscle wall with crude stitching. The hernia surgery tools were simple but effective at causing maximum trauma. Sharp knives for cutting, crude needles for stitching, and iron clamps for holding tissue in place. The procedures were performed without anesthesia, often taking hours as the barber surgeon struggled to understand the anatomy he was cutting through. Most hernia patients died from infection or internal bleeding. Those who survived often faced recurring hernias because the repairs were so poorly done. Yet the surgeries continued because hernias could be debilitating, preventing men from working and supporting their families. Skin conditions provided another opportunity for barber surgeons to demonstrate their dangerous incompetence. They treated everything from simple acne to serious skin cancers using the same basic approach: cut it out and cauterize the wound. The tools for dermatological surgery were crude in the extreme. Sharp knives for cutting, red-hot irons for burning, and various scraping instruments for removing what they considered diseased tissue. They had no understanding of the difference between benign and malignant growths, so they treated everything with equal aggressiveness. Many patients ended up disfigured or dead from procedures that should have been simple. A minor skin blemish might be treated with such aggressive cutting and burning that the patient developed massive infections or was left with horrific scarring. The barber surgeon's approach to pain management was as primitive as everything else they did. They had access to some natural substances that provided limited pain relief, but these were often more dangerous than helpful. Mandrake root was sometimes used as an anesthetic, but the dosage required for pain relief was often close to the lethal dose. Patients who received mandrake often died from poisoning rather than from their original condition. Opium was occasionally available, but it was expensive and its effects were poorly understood. Barber surgeons might give doses that were either completely ineffective or fatally strong, with no middle ground. More commonly, patients were simply given alcohol to dull the pain. They would be forced to drink large quantities of beer or wine before surgery, which created its own problems. Drunk patients were harder to control during procedures, and alcohol interfered with blood clotting, leading to increased bleeding. The psychological trauma inflicted by barber surgeons was almost as devastating as their physical interventions. Patients who survived their procedures often suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The memory of lying conscious while someone sawed through their bones or probed their internal organs with crude instruments haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Many became terrified of any medical treatment, preferring to die from treatable conditions rather than face another encounter with a barber surgeon. This psychological damage extended to entire communities. Towns where barber surgeons practiced developed a culture of medical fear that was passed down through generations. Parents would tell children horror stories about what happened to people who went to the barber surgeon, creating a legacy of trauma that outlasted the practitioners themselves. The social dynamics of barber surgery were equally disturbing. These practitioners occupied a strange position in medieval society, simultaneously essential and reviled. People needed their services, but feared their touch. They were craftsmen who worked with the most precious material of all, human life, yet they were treated as social outcasts. This social isolation may have contributed to their callousness. Barber surgeons developed a professional detachment that allowed them to continue practicing, despite their terrible success rates. They convinced themselves that their failures were due to divine will or patient weakness, rather than their own incompetence. The economic incentives of barber surgery were perverse in ways that made the practice even more dangerous. Barber surgeons were paid for performing procedures, not for achieving successful outcomes. This meant they had financial motivation to operate on patients who didn't need surgery and to perform unnecessary procedures. A simple condition that might heal on its own could be turned into a profitable surgical intervention. A minor wound might be treated with amputation because amputation paid better than wound care. The worse the treatment, the higher the fee, creating a system that rewarded medical incompetence. The guild system that governed barber surgeons provided some regulation, but it was regulation based on tradition rather than effectiveness. guild standards required members to perform procedures in specific ways, even when those ways were demonstrably harmful. A barber surgeon who tried to innovate or improve his techniques might be expelled from the guild for violating traditional practices. This system actively discouraged medical progress and ensured that dangerous techniques would be perpetuated indefinitely. The apprenticeship system made things even worse by creating a cycle of ignorance that passed from master to student. Young apprentices learned not just techniques, but attitudes, absorbing the casual cruelty and professional indifference that characterized their masters. These apprentices would go on to become masters themselves, teaching the same failed techniques to the next generation. Medical knowledge didn't advance, it simply repeated itself in an endless cycle of incompetence and suffering. The geographic spread of barber surgery ensured that no corner of medieval Europe was safe from their ministrations. Every town, every village, every monastery had its local barber surgeon. They were as common as blacksmiths and far more dangerous. Rural areas were particularly vulnerable because they had fewer medical options. A village might have only one barber surgeon serving an entire region, giving patients no choice but to submit to his treatments or go without medical care entirely. Urban areas offered more choices, but not necessarily better outcomes. Cities might have multiple barber surgeons competing for customers, but competition didn't improve quality. If anything, it encouraged practitioners to offer more dramatic procedures to attract patients. The tools of civilian barber surgery were even more varied and terrifying than their military counterparts. Peacetime allowed for specialization, so barber surgeons developed specific instruments for different types of procedures. Eye surgery required thin needles and small knives. Dental work used various types of forceps and extractors. Gynecological procedures demanded long, curved instruments that could reach internal organs. Each specialty had its own collection of crude, dangerous tools. These instruments were often made by local craftsmen who had no medical knowledge and no understanding of what the tools would be used for. A blacksmith might forge a surgical knife using the same techniques he used to make horseshoes, with predictably poor results. The maintenance of surgical instruments was another source of danger. Barber surgeons had no understanding of metallurgy or tool care. Their instruments were often dull, rusty, or damaged, making procedures even more traumatic and dangerous than they needed to be. Sharpening was done haphazardly, often creating uneven edges or weakening the metal. Rust was simply scraped off rather than properly removed. Broken instruments were repaired with crude welding that created weak points and sharp edges. The storage of these tools was equally primitive. They might be kept in leather pouches, wooden boxes, or simply laid out on tables where they collected dust and contamination. There was no concept of sterile storage or proper organization. When a barber surgeon reached for an instrument during a procedure, he never knew exactly what condition it would be in. A knife might be dull, a forceps might be loose, a probe might break during use. This uncertainty added another element of danger to already risky procedures. The working conditions in barber surgery shops were appalling by any standard. These were typically small, poorly lit spaces with minimal ventilation. Blood, hair, and other biological material accumulated on every surface. Lighting was provided by candles or oil lamps, creating flickering shadows that made precise work impossible. The smoke from these lights filled the air with additional pollutants, while the heat made the already cramped spaces even more uncomfortable. Ventilation was non-existent in most shops. Windows were small and often kept closed to maintain privacy during procedures. This meant that the air was thick with the smell of blood, burned flesh, and human waste. The floors of these shops were rarely cleaned properly. Sawdust might be scattered to absorb blood, but it was seldom changed. Organic material decomposed underfoot, creating breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Work surfaces were equally contaminated. A table used for haircuts in the morning might be used for surgery in the afternoon, with only a cursory cleaning in between. Cross-contamination was not just possible, but inevitable. The clothing worn by barber surgeons during procedures was another source of contamination. They typically wore their regular clothes, which became progressively more blood-stained as the day went on. There was no concept of surgical garb or sterile clothing. Aprons were sometimes worn, but these were made of leather or cloth that was rarely washed. They served more to protect the barber surgeon's regular clothes than to maintain cleanliness during procedures. Hand washing was primitive at best. Barber surgeons might rinse their hands in a basin of water between patients, but the same water was used all day. By afternoon, it was more contaminated than the hands it was supposed to clean. The concept of sterile technique was completely unknown. Instruments that had just been used inside one patient's body would be used on the next patient without any cleaning. Hands that had been inside infected wounds would touch healthy tissue moments later. This systematic contamination meant that every patient treated by a barber surgeon was exposed not only to the risks of their own procedure, but to infections from every previous patient. Cross-contamination was so common that it was essentially guaranteed. The record-keeping practices of barber surgeons were as primitive as their medical techniques. Most kept no records at all of their procedures or outcomes. There was no systematic attempt to learn from failures or improve techniques. This lack of documentation meant that medical knowledge never accumulated. Each barber surgeon had to learn through his own trial and error, repeating the same mistakes that countless predecessors had made. When successful techniques were occasionally developed, they were rarely shared or documented. Medical knowledge died with its practitioners, ensuring that each generation started from scratch. The few records that do exist paint a horrifying picture of surgical outcomes. Mortality rates for most procedures exceeded 50%, and for complex surgeries, they approached 100%. Yet these statistics were never compiled or analyzed by the practitioners themselves. The absence of medical literature meant that barber surgeons had no way to compare their techniques or outcomes with others. They operated in isolation, convinced that their methods were the best available, regardless of their actual effectiveness. This isolation also meant that advances in medical knowledge were never shared. A barber surgeon in France might develop a slightly better technique for treating wounds, but a surgeon in England would never hear about it. The language barriers of medieval Europe made things even worse. Medical knowledge was rarely written down, and when it was usually in Latin, which most barber surgeons couldn't read. Oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting medical knowledge, but this was unreliable and prone to distortion. Techniques became corrupted as they passed from person to person, often becoming more dangerous rather than more effective. The result was a medical system that not only failed to advance but actually regressed over time. Later practitioners were often less skilled than their predecessors, as knowledge was lost and techniques were forgotten. The economic structure of medieval society ensured that the best medical care was reserved for those who could afford university-trained physicians, while the poor were left to the mercies of barber surgeons. This created a two-tiered medical system where your chances of survival depended more on your social class than on the nature of your illness. The wealthy might consult learned physicians who, while still operating with medieval knowledge, at least understood the importance of observation and careful diagnosis. The poor, who made up the vast majority of the population, had no choice but to seek treatment from barber surgeons, whose primary qualification was the ability to afford a set of crude instruments. This economic divide meant that medical advances, when they occurred, benefited only the elite. New techniques or treatments developed for wealthy patients were rarely passed down to practitioners who served the common people. The barber surgeons who served the poor had no incentive to improve their techniques because their patients had no other options. They could maintain terrible success rates without losing customers because there was nowhere else for people to go. This lack of competition meant that incompetent practitioners could continue working indefinitely, killing patient after patient without facing any consequences. The guild system protected them from criticism, and the absence of alternatives protected them from market forces. The religious context of medieval medicine added another layer of horror to barber surgery. Many practitioners believed that suffering during medical procedures was spiritually beneficial, that pain brought patients closer to God. This theological justification for cruelty meant that barber surgeons felt no obligation to minimize pain or develop gentler techniques. If anything, they believed that painful procedures were more effective because they involved greater spiritual purification. Patients were encouraged to view their suffering as penance for their sins, to accept pain as God's will rather than as a result of medical incompetence. This religious framework made it impossible for patients to complain about their treatment or seek better care. The Church's prohibition on clerical involvement in surgery had created the barber surgeon profession, but religious doctrine continued to influence their practices in ways that made treatment even more dangerous and traumatic. The integration of spiritual and medical beliefs meant that barber surgeons often combined surgical procedures with religious rituals, creating elaborate ceremonies around what should have been simple medical treatments. These rituals added time and complexity to procedures, increasing the risk of complications while providing no medical benefit. But they served to justify the barber surgeon's role as both healer and spiritual guide. The combination of medical ignorance, primitive tools, contaminated working conditions, and religious justification for suffering created a perfect storm of horror that defined civilian barber surgery throughout the medieval period. These weren't isolated incidents or occasional failures. They were the systematic, everyday reality of medical care for the vast majority of medieval Europeans. Every village, every town, every city had its local barber surgeon, and every one of them was a walking catastrophe waiting to happen. The terror they inspired wasn't superstition or ignorance. It was the rational response of people who understood, through bitter experience, that the cure was often worse than the disease, that seeking medical help was often tantamount to signing your own death warrant. And yet, the most terrifying thing about medieval barber surgeons wasn't their incompetence or their cruelty. It was their absolute certainty that they were healers, their unshakable belief that they were helping their patients even as they butchered them on crude tables with rusty instruments. This wasn't malice. It was something far more frightening. The horror of good intentions combined with absolute ignorance. The nightmare of healing turned into harm through the deadly combination of confidence and incompetence that defined medieval barber surgery. The truly terrifying aspect of medieval barber surgery wasn't just the individual procedures or the primitive tools. It was the complete ecosystem of ignorance that surrounded these practitioners, an entire medical philosophy built on foundations of sand and cemented with centuries of deadly tradition. Let's talk about diagnosis, because before a barber surgeon could begin butchering you with his crude instruments, he first had to figure out what was wrong with you, and his diagnostic methods were every bit as horrifying as his treatments. The centerpiece of medieval diagnosis was uroscopy, the practice of examining a patient's urine to determine their ailment. But this wasn't just looking at color or clarity. Oh no, that would be far too simple for the sophisticated medical minds of the Middle Ages. Barber surgeons would taste the urine, swirling it around in their mouths like wine connoisseurs sampling a vintage. Picture this scene. You arrive at the barber surgeon's shop, complaining of stomach pain. He hands you a flask and instructs you to provide a sample. You comply, hoping for quick relief. The barber surgeon takes your warm urine, holds it up to the light, swirls it gently, and then brings it to his lips for a thorough tasting. He smacks his lips thoughtfully, perhaps taking a second sip to confirm his initial impression. "Ah yes," he declares with the confidence of a man who has just tasted dozens of other patients' urine that same day. definitely an excess of yellow bile. I can taste the sulfur. We'll need to drain at least 2 pints of blood to restore your natural balance. This wasn't considered disgusting or unsanitary. It was sophisticated medical analysis, the cutting edge of diagnostic technology. Barber surgeons carried elaborate urine charts that matched different colors, tastes, and consistencies to specific ailments. Sweet urine meant diabetes. Cloudy urine indicated kidney problems. Red urine suggested an excess of blood that needed immediate draining. The fact that these diagnoses were complete nonsense didn't matter. What mattered was that they provided a framework for action, a systematic approach that made barber surgeons feel scientific and authoritative. The patient's actual symptoms were often secondary to what the urine tasting revealed. But uroscopy was just the beginning of medieval diagnostic horror. Barber surgeons also practiced something called physiognomy, the belief that a person's character and health could be determined by examining their facial features. A prominent nose might indicate a sanguine temperament requiring bloodletting. Deep-set eyes could suggest melancholic tendencies, needing purging. This meant that your medical treatment might be determined not by your symptoms, but by the shape of your face. If you had the misfortune to be born with features that the barber surgeon associated with particular humoral imbalances, you'd receive treatment for conditions you didn't even have. The concept of patient history was virtually non-existent. Barber surgeons rarely asked detailed questions about symptoms, onset, or progression of illness. They might inquire about recent behavior or diet, but only to confirm what their urine tasting and facial analysis had already revealed. This lack of thorough examination meant that serious conditions were regularly misdiagnosed and mistreated. A heart attack might be treated as indigestion. A stroke could be diagnosed as demonic possession. Cancer was often dismissed as a minor imbalance requiring simple bloodletting. The seasonal timing of diagnosis added another layer of medieval medical madness. Barber surgeons believed that certain treatments were only effective during specific times of year, aligned with astrological influences and humoral fluctuations. Spring was considered the ideal time for bloodletting because the body's humors were thought to be most active. Summer treatments focused on cooling the body's excess heat. Autumn was for purging and preparation for winter. Winter procedures were generally avoided because the body's natural heat was considered too weak to support healing. This meant that a patient arriving in winter with a condition requiring immediate attention might be told to wait until spring for treatment. By then, of course, they were often dead, but the barber surgeon felt confident that he had followed proper medical protocol. The role of astrology in medieval diagnosis cannot be overstated. Barber surgeons consulted star charts before making treatment decisions, believing that planetary alignments influenced both disease and healing. Mercury's position might determine the best day for tooth extraction. Venus's phase could influence the success of eye surgery. Patients were sometimes told that their condition was caused by being born under an unlucky star, and that treatment would only be effective when celestial conditions were favorable. This astrological medicine created delays that often proved fatal, but it also provided convenient excuses when treatments failed. The integration of humoral theory with diagnostic practice created a closed system of medical reasoning that was impossible to challenge or disprove. If a treatment failed, it wasn't because the diagnosis was wrong or the procedure was incompetent. It was because the patient's humoral balance was more complex than initially understood. This circular logic protected barber surgeons from having to confront their failures or improve their techniques. Every death could be explained away as the result of particularly stubborn humoral imbalances or unfavorable astrological influences. The social dynamics of medieval diagnosis were equally disturbing. Barber surgeons often involved the patient's family and community in the diagnostic process, creating public spectacles around what should have been private medical consultations. A diagnosis session might draw crowds of neighbors and relatives, all offering their own interpretations of the patient's condition. The barber surgeon would hold court like a performer, tasting urine samples and pronouncing judgments with theatrical flair. This public nature of diagnosis created additional pressure on barber surgeons to appear confident and knowledgeable, even when they had no idea what was wrong with the patient. Admitting uncertainty would undermine their authority and potentially cost them customers. The result was a system that rewarded confident ignorance over careful observation, dramatic pronouncements over cautious analysis. The more certain a barber surgeon appeared, the more patients trusted him, regardless of his actual success rate. The diagnostic tools available to medieval barber surgeons were as primitive as their surgical instruments. They had no thermometers to measure fever, no devices to check blood pressure, no instruments to examine internal organs. Their primary tools were their senses: sight, smell, taste, and touch. They would examine skin color, feel for swellings, listen to breathing patterns, and of course, taste various bodily fluids. These observations were then filtered through the lens of humoral theory and astrological belief. The absence of objective measurement meant that diagnosis was entirely subjective. What one barber surgeon might interpret as a dangerous fever, another might dismiss as a minor heat imbalance. There was no standardization, no way to verify or compare diagnostic accuracy. This subjectivity extended to treatment decisions as well. Two barber surgeons examining the same patient might reach completely different conclusions about what treatment was needed. The patient had no way to determine which diagnosis was more accurate or which treatment was more likely to succeed. The apprenticeship system that trained new barber surgeons ensured that diagnostic errors were passed down from generation to generation. Young apprentices learned not just techniques, but interpretative frameworks, absorbing their master's biases and misconceptions along with their practical skills. An apprentice who learned that sweet-tasting urine always indicated the need for aggressive bloodletting would carry that belief throughout his career, regardless of whether it actually helped patients. The training system actively discouraged questioning or innovation. The economic incentives of medieval medicine created additional pressure for dramatic diagnoses. Patients who were told they had minor conditions requiring simple treatments generated less revenue than those diagnosed with serious imbalances requiring extensive procedures. This meant that barber surgeons had financial motivation to discover complex problems requiring expensive solutions. A simple headache might be diagnosed as a dangerous humoral crisis, requiring immediate and costly intervention. The lack of medical literature meant that diagnostic knowledge was never systematically recorded or analysed. Each barber surgeon developed his own interpretative methods based on personal experience and local tradition. This isolation prevented the development of standardized diagnostic criteria or the identification of common errors. Mistakes were repeated endlessly because there was no mechanism for learning from collective experience. The religious context of medieval diagnosis added supernatural elements that made rational medical thinking even more difficult. Barber surgeons often attributed diseases to divine punishment, demonic influence, or spiritual contamination. A patient's moral character might be considered more relevant to diagnosis than their physical symptoms. Someone known for sinful behavior might be diagnosed with spiritual ailments requiring religious as well as medical treatment. This moralization of medicine meant that diagnosis often became a form of judgment, with barber surgeons acting as both medical and spiritual authorities. Patients were not just sick, they were sinful, and their treatment needed to address both physical and moral corruption. The integration of folk beliefs with medical practice created diagnostic frameworks that were completely divorced from biological reality. Diseases might be attributed to witchcraft, evil spirits, or curses rather than physical causes. These supernatural diagnoses led to treatments that were more ritual than medical, involving prayers, charms, and ceremonial procedures designed to combat spiritual rather than physical ailments. The seasonal nature of medieval life also influenced diagnostic patterns in ways that had nothing to do with actual disease prevalence. Barber surgeons expected certain conditions to appear at specific times of year and often diagnosed them whether they were present or not. Spring brought diagnoses of humoral imbalances that needed correction after winter's stagnation. Summer diagnoses focused on overheating and excess energy. Autumn treatments prepared the body for winter's challenges. This seasonal bias meant that patients presenting with the same symptoms might receive completely different diagnoses depending on when they sought treatment. The calendar was often more influential than actual medical observation. The social status of patients also influenced diagnostic decisions in ways that had nothing to do with medical evidence. Wealthy patients were more likely to be diagnosed with complex, interesting conditions that justified expensive treatments. Poor patients were often dismissed with simple diagnoses that required minimal intervention. Their symptoms were attributed to lifestyle factors or moral failings rather than genuine medical conditions requiring treatment. This class-based diagnostic bias meant that the quality of medical analysis depended more on the patient's ability to pay than on the severity of their condition. The rich received elaborate diagnostic procedures, while the poor were barely examined. The absence of medical records meant that diagnostic accuracy was never tracked or evaluated. Barber surgeons had no systematic way to determine whether their diagnostic methods were actually effective. A practitioner who consistently misdiagnosed conditions would never know it because there was no follow-up system to track outcomes. Patients either recovered, died, or disappeared, but their fates were rarely connected back to the accuracy of initial diagnoses. This lack of feedback meant that diagnostic methods never improved through experience. Ineffective techniques persisted indefinitely because there was no mechanism for identifying and eliminating them. The competitive nature of medieval medicine created additional pressure for dramatic and memorable diagnoses. Barber surgeons who offered mundane explanations for patients' conditions were less likely to attract customers than those who provided exotic and fascinating diagnostic narratives. This encouraged the development of increasingly elaborate diagnostic theories that prioritized entertainment value over medical accuracy. Patients wanted explanations that were interesting and comprehensive, even if they were completely wrong. The result was a diagnostic system that was optimized for customer satisfaction rather than medical effectiveness. The most successful barber surgeons were often those who provided the most compelling stories about their patients' conditions. The integration of diagnostic and treatment decisions meant that barber surgeons were often committed to particular courses of action before they fully understood what was wrong with their patients. The diagnostic process became a justification for predetermined treatments rather than a genuine investigation. This backwards approach to medicine meant that treatments drove diagnoses rather than the other way around. If a barber surgeon specialized in bloodletting, he would tend to diagnose conditions that required bloodletting, regardless of what was actually wrong with the patient. The theological framework of medieval medicine influenced diagnostic thinking in ways that made rational analysis nearly impossible. Diseases were often seen as tests of faith or opportunities for spiritual growth rather than problems to be solved. This spiritual interpretation of illness meant that diagnostic accuracy was less important than moral instruction. The goal wasn't necessarily to identify and treat the underlying condition, but to provide a framework for understanding suffering in religious terms. The communal nature of medieval life meant that diagnostic decisions were often made by committee, with family members, neighbours, and local authorities all contributing their opinions about what was wrong with the patient. This collective diagnostic process diluted medical expertise while amplifying popular misconceptions and superstitions. The loudest voice often prevailed over the most knowledgeable one. The lack of privacy in medieval medicine meant that diagnostic consultations became public performances, with barber surgeons playing to audiences rather than focusing on careful medical analysis. This theatrical aspect of diagnosis encouraged dramatic pronouncements and spectacular treatments rather than quiet, methodical investigation. The entertainment value of the diagnostic process often outweighed its medical utility. The absence of medical specialization meant that barber surgeons were expected to diagnose and treat every conceivable condition, from simple cuts to complex internal diseases, despite having no training in most areas of medicine. This impossible breadth of responsibility ensured that most diagnoses were made by practitioners who had little or no relevant experience with the conditions they were trying to identify. The result was a medical system where diagnostic accuracy was essentially random, where patients' fates depended more on luck than on medical skill, and where the very process of seeking medical help often created more problems than it solved. And once the barber surgeon had completed his diagnostic ritual, once he had tasted your urine and consulted his star charts and pronounced his confident judgment about your humoral imbalances, the real horror began. Because now it was time for treatment, and medieval treatment made medieval diagnosis look like a model of scientific precision. The treatment protocols developed by barber surgeons weren't just wrong, they were systematically, catastrophically wrong in ways that turned minor ailments into death sentences, and simple procedures into exercises in medieval torture. Let's examine the barber surgeon's approach to treating common conditions, because understanding their treatment logic reveals just how completely divorced medieval medicine was from any concept of actual healing. Take fever, one of the most common complaints brought to medieval practitioners. In the modern world, we understand fever as the body's natural response to infection, a sign that the immune system is fighting disease. We treat it with rest, fluids, and medication to reduce discomfort while supporting the body's natural healing processes. Medieval barber surgeons saw fever as evidence of excess heat in the body, a dangerous accumulation of hot humours that needed immediate and aggressive removal. Their solution was bloodletting, lots of it, combined with purging to drain the body of its excess heat through every possible avenue. A patient arriving with a simple fever might have several pints of blood drained through strategic cuts in major veins. Then they'd be given powerful laxatives to empty their bowels, followed by emetics to induce vomiting. The goal was to reduce the body's heat by removing as much fluid as possible. The result was predictable. Patients who might have recovered from their original illness within days instead died from dehydration, blood loss, and the shock of aggressive treatment. The cure killed far more effectively than the disease, but barber surgeons interpreted these deaths not as treatment failures, but as evidence that the patient's condition was more serious than initially diagnosed. If bloodletting didn't work, it meant more bloodletting was needed. If purging failed, stronger purgatives were required. This logic created a deadly spiral where failures led to more aggressive treatments, which led to more failures, which led to even more aggressive interventions, until the patient finally died from the accumulated trauma of medical care. The treatment of wounds reveals another aspect of medieval medical horror, the complete absence of any understanding about infection or healing. When a patient arrived with a cut or injury, the barber surgeon's first instinct was to clean the wound using methods that actually introduced contamination. Wine or vinegar might be poured into the wound, not because they understood the antiseptic properties of alcohol, but because they believed these substances would balance the humours and prevent corruption. The same wine that had been used on previous patients, stored in contaminated containers, applied with dirty instruments. Then came the probing. Barber surgeons believed they needed to explore wounds thoroughly to remove any foreign matter or corrupted tissue. They would insert fingers, probes, or other instruments deep into wounds, often causing more damage than the original injury. This probing was done without any understanding of anatomy or sterile technique. The same hands that had just examined another patient's infected wound would be inserted into a fresh injury, transferring bacteria and introducing new contamination. If the wound was deemed serious enough, it would be cauterized with red-hot iron. This wasn't done to sterilize the area, but to seal what they believed were corrupted humors inside the body. The burning flesh was seen as evidence that the treatment was working, that evil influences were being driven out by purifying fire. The pain of cauterization was considered beneficial, a sign that the body's natural heat was being restored through the application of external fire. Patients who screamed during the procedure were demonstrating that the treatment was effective. Wound dressing followed equally contaminated protocols. Bandages were rarely clean and never sterile. They might be reused from previous patients or made from whatever cloth was available. The same bandages used to wrap a gangrenous limb might be used on a fresh wound the next day. These dressings were left in place for extended periods, sometimes weeks, allowing infections to develop and spread beneath layers of increasingly putrid cloth. When the bandages were finally changed, the removal process often tore away healing tissue and introduced new contamination. The treatment of broken bones showcased the barber surgeon's combination of good intentions and catastrophic execution. They understood that broken bones needed to be set and immobilized, but their methods often caused more damage than the original injury. Bone setting was done through manipulation and force, with the barber surgeon pulling and twisting limbs to align the fractures. There was no understanding of the need for gentle handling or the importance of maintaining blood circulation. Splints were made from whatever materials were available: wood, metal, or even stones. These were bound tightly to the limb using rope or leather straps, often cutting off circulation and causing tissue death. The immobilization period was arbitrary and extreme. Patients might be kept in rigid splints for months, regardless of how the bone was healing. Many developed permanent disabilities, not from their original injuries, but from the prolonged immobilization and poor splinting techniques. Infection was common in splinted limbs because the tight bindings created environments where bacteria could thrive. Gangrene often set in beneath the splints, leading to amputations that might have been unnecessary with proper treatment. The barber surgeon's approach to internal medicine was equally disastrous. Stomach problems were treated with aggressive purging that often made conditions worse. Patients with ulcers or internal bleeding were given powerful laxatives that increased blood loss and damaged already compromised digestive systems. Respiratory conditions were treated with bloodletting and cupping, procedures that weakened patients who needed their strength to fight infection. Pneumonia patients who might have recovered with rest and supportive care instead died from the trauma of having their blood drained during the illness. Mental health conditions were particularly subject to brutal treatment methods. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions were attributed to humoral imbalances or demonic influence, leading to treatments that were more torture than therapy. Patients with mental illness might be bled extensively to remove corrupted humors from their brains. They could be subjected to trepanation, having holes drilled in their skulls to release evil spirits, or they might be given powerful drugs that caused hallucinations and further psychological trauma. The treatment of women's health issues revealed the intersection of medical ignorance with social prejudice. Menstrual problems were often attributed to an excess of corrupt blood that needed to be drained through additional bloodletting. Pregnancy complications were treated with procedures that endangered both mother and child. Childbirth was attended by barber surgeons who had no understanding of obstetrics or the delicate nature of the birthing process. Their interventions often turned normal deliveries into medical emergencies, while actual emergencies were made worse by inappropriate treatments. The economic structure of medieval medicine meant that treatments were often chosen based on their profitability rather than their medical appropriateness. Complex, expensive procedures generated more revenue than simple, effective treatments. This created perverse incentives, where barber surgeons were financially motivated to provide the most elaborate and dangerous treatments rather than the most appropriate ones. A condition that could be treated with rest and observation might, instead, be subjected to bloodletting, purging, and surgery. The guild system that governed barber surgeons actually made these problems worse by standardizing harmful practices and preventing innovation. Guild members were required to follow traditional treatment protocols even when those protocols were demonstrably ineffective. A barber surgeon who tried to develop gentler or more effective treatments might be expelled from the guild for violating established practices. This system actively discouraged medical progress and ensured that harmful treatments would be perpetuated indefinitely. The apprenticeship system transmitted not just techniques, but attitudes, creating generations of practitioners who believed that aggressive, painful treatments were more effective than gentle ones. Apprentices learned that medicine should hurt, that effective treatments required dramatic interventions. This culture of medical aggression meant that barber surgeons competed to develop more extreme treatments, believing that greater pain and trauma indicated superior medical care. The most successful practitioners were often those who inflicted the most suffering on their patients. The religious context of medieval medicine provided theological justification for painful treatments. Suffering was seen as spiritually beneficial, a way for patients to atone for their sins and grow closer to God through physical trials. This religious framework made it impossible for patients to complain about painful treatments or seek gentler alternatives. Questioning the barber surgeon's methods was tantamount to questioning God's will. The integration of treatment with religious ritual meant that medical procedures often became elaborate ceremonies designed more for spiritual effect than physical healing. These rituals added time and complexity to treatments while providing no medical benefit. The lack of follow-up care meant that barber surgeons rarely learned whether their treatments were actually effective. Patients either recovered, died, or disappeared, but their outcomes were seldom connected back to the treatments they had received. This absence of feedback meant that treatment methods never improved through experience. Ineffective techniques persisted indefinitely because there was no mechanism for identifying and eliminating them. The competitive nature of medieval medicine encouraged the development of increasingly dramatic and memorable treatments. Barber surgeons who offered routine care were less likely to attract customers than those who provided spectacular therapeutic interventions. This market pressure created a medical arms race where practitioners competed to develop the most impressive treatments rather than the most effective ones. The goal became entertainment and amazement rather than healing. The seasonal nature of medieval medicine meant that treatments were often timed according to astrological beliefs rather than medical necessity. Patients might be forced to wait for favorable planetary alignments before receiving urgent care. This delay often proved fatal, but barber surgeons felt confident that they were following proper medical protocol by waiting for celestially appropriate timing. The stars were considered more important than the patient's immediate needs. The integration of humoral theory with treatment decisions created a medical system that was completely divorced from biological reality. Treatments were chosen based on theoretical balance rather than observed effectiveness. This theoretical approach to medicine meant that barber surgeons felt no need to test or verify their treatments. If the theory said bloodletting should work, then bloodletting was the correct treatment, regardless of what actually happened to patients. The social dynamics of medieval treatment created additional pressure for dramatic and visible interventions. Treatments that could be performed publicly were preferred over those that required privacy or subtlety. This exhibitionist aspect of medicine meant that barber surgeons often chose treatments based on their theatrical value rather than their medical appropriateness. The goal was to impress audiences rather than heal patients. The absence of anesthesia meant that all treatments were exercises in pain tolerance rather than medical precision. Procedures were designed to be completed quickly rather than carefully. leading to increased trauma and reduced effectiveness. This emphasis on speed over precision meant that barber surgeons developed techniques that prioritized their own convenience over patient welfare. The faster a procedure could be completed, the less time they had to spend listening to screaming. The lack of understanding about pain management meant that patient suffering was seen as inevitable and even beneficial. There was no attempt to minimize discomfort or develop gentler techniques. This acceptance of pain as a necessary part of treatment created a medical culture that was fundamentally cruel, where patient suffering was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged as a sign of effective therapy. The treatment protocols developed by medieval barber surgeons represented the systematic application of ignorance to human suffering. They weren't just wrong, they were wrong in ways that maximized harm while minimizing any possibility of actual healing. And yet these practitioners continued their work with absolute confidence in their methods, convinced that they were providing the best possible care to their patients. They saw themselves as healers, as servants of God, as skilled craftsmen, applying ancient wisdom to modern problems. This combination of good intentions with catastrophic ignorance created a medical system that was more dangerous than no medical system at all. Patients who avoided barber surgeons often had better outcomes than those who sought their help. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval medical treatment wasn't the pain or the ignorance, or even the high mortality rates. It was the absolute certainty with which these procedures were performed, the unshakable confidence of practitioners who never doubted their methods, despite overwhelming evidence of their failure. Because when ignorance is combined with authority, when cruelty is justified by tradition, when suffering is sanctified by religion, you get something far more dangerous than simple incompetence. You get a system that actively resists improvement, that punishes innovation, that turns healing into harm with the blessing of society and the protection of law. And that system, embodied in the blood-stained aprons and crude instruments of medieval barber surgeons, represents one of the darkest chapters in the long history of human attempts to heal the sick and ease suffering. It stands as a monument to the dangers of medical practice divorced from medical knowledge, and as a reminder of how quickly good intentions can become instruments of terror when wielded by ignorant hands. The guild system that protected these medieval butchers wasn't just a professional organization. It was a fortress of ignorance, designed to shield incompetent practitioners from the consequences of their failures and ensure that deadly techniques would be passed down through generations like cursed heirlooms. When a barber surgeon joined a guild, he wasn't just gaining professional credentials. He was entering a brotherhood of sanctioned killers, a fraternity that would protect him from criticism, shield him from accountability, and guarantee his right to continue practicing, regardless of how many patients died under his knife. The guild examination process reveals just how completely divorced medieval medicine was from any concept of actual competence. To become a certified barber surgeon, an apprentice didn't need to demonstrate successful outcomes or show evidence of healing patients. He simply needed to prove he could perform traditional procedures in traditional ways. The examiners weren't looking for innovation or effectiveness. They were testing conformity. Could the candidate properly drain blood from the median cubital vein? Could he saw through bone in under 5 minutes? Could he cauterize a wound without flinching at the screams? These were the skills that mattered, not whether patients actually survived the procedures. A candidate who questioned traditional methods or suggested gentler techniques would be failed immediately. The guild system actively punished medical thinking and rewarded mechanical repetition of deadly practices. This created a certification process that was worse than useless. It gave official sanction to practitioners whose primary qualification was their willingness to inflict traditional forms of suffering on their patients. The guild's fee structure reveals another layer of institutional horror. Members paid dues based on the number and complexity of procedures they performed, creating financial incentives for unnecessary surgery and aggressive treatment. A barber surgeon who treated patients conservatively, using rest and observation instead of bloodletting and amputation, would generate less guild revenue and face pressure from other members to increase his surgical activity. This system turned patient welfare into a secondary consideration behind guild finances. The more procedures performed, the healthier the guild's treasury, regardless of what happened to the people being treated. The guild's disciplinary procedures were equally perverse. Members could be censured for failing to follow traditional practices, for charging too little for their services, or for treating patients outside their designated territory. But they were never disciplined for killing patients through incompetence. A barber surgeon who amputated healthy limbs, who killed patients through botched procedures, who spread infection through contaminated instruments, faced no professional consequences as long as he followed guild protocols. This created a professional environment where conformity was valued over competence, where tradition trumped results, and where the worst practitioners were often the most successful because they followed rules without questioning their effectiveness. The guild's territorial system divided cities and regions into exclusive zones where only certain practitioners could work. This eliminated competition and gave each barber surgeon a captive patient population who had no choice but to accept his services. When you can't shop around for better medical care, when you're stuck with whatever practitioner happens to control your neighborhood, quality becomes irrelevant. The local barber surgeon could maintain terrible success rates without losing customers because there was literally nowhere else to go. This monopolistic system removed any market pressure for improvement. Bad practitioners thrived alongside good ones because patients had no alternatives and no way to compare outcomes. The guild's training standards were another source of systematic horror. Apprentices were required to serve for specific periods, usually 7 years, regardless of how quickly they mastered the necessary skills or how slowly they learned. This meant that some apprentices, who could have been competent practitioners in 3 years, were held back by artificial time requirements, while others who needed 10 years of training were certified after 7 because the guild schedule demanded it. The training wasn't individualized or adapted to the apprentice's abilities. It was a one-size-fits-all system that produced practitioners with wildly varying levels of competence, all carrying the same guild certification. The guild's standardization of instruments and techniques created another layer of institutional incompetence. All members were required to use similar tools and follow similar procedures, preventing any innovation or improvement in surgical methods. A guild member who developed a better surgical knife or discovered a more effective technique was forbidden from using it unless the entire guild adopted the innovation. This rarely happened because change required consensus among practitioners who had invested their careers in traditional methods. This standardization meant that medical progress was essentially impossible within the guild system. Improvements could only come from outside the profession, from people who weren't bound by guild regulations and traditional practices. The guild's relationship with religious authorities added another dimension to the horror. Guild practices needed approval from church officials, who often had their own ideas about appropriate medical treatment. Religious doctrine influenced guild standards in ways that made medical care even more dangerous. Treatments that caused suffering were favored because pain was considered spiritually beneficial. Gentle techniques were discouraged because they didn't provide adequate opportunities for spiritual purification through physical trial. This religious oversight meant that medical decisions were made based on theological considerations rather than patient welfare. The guild became an instrument of religious policy rather than a professional organization focused on healing. The guild's record-keeping practices ensured that evidence of systematic failure would never accumulate. They kept meticulous records of fees paid, procedures performed, and territorial boundaries, but no records of patient outcomes or treatment effectiveness. This deliberate ignorance meant that patterns of failure could never be identified or addressed. Individual practitioners might kill dozens of patients, but there was no mechanism for tracking these deaths or connecting them to specific techniques or practitioners. The Guild's protection of incompetent members created a system where the worst practitioners often had the longest careers. Members who killed patients through gross negligence were defended by the Guild as long as they had followed traditional procedures. This protection racket meant that patients had no recourse when treatments went wrong. They couldn't sue Guild members, couldn't report them to authorities, couldn't even warn other potential patients about dangerous practitioners. The Guild's influence extended beyond medical practice into legal and social spheres. Guild members often served as expert witnesses in legal cases, determining whether deaths were due to natural causes or criminal activity. This meant that the same people who were killing patients through medical incompetence were also deciding whether other deaths were suspicious. The foxes were guarding the henhouse, with predictable results. The Guild's political connections ensured that their practices would be protected by law. Guild members often held positions in local government or maintained close relationships with political leaders. This political influence meant that attempts to regulate or reform barber surgery were routinely blocked. The Guild could use its connections to prevent any external oversight or accountability. The Guild's economic power in medieval communities made them virtually untouchable. They were often among the wealthiest and most influential citizens, with the resources to defend their interests against any challenge. This economic clout meant that even when their failures were obvious, even when their incompetence was widely known, they retained their positions and continued practicing because they had the money and connections to protect themselves. The Guild's apprenticeship system created a pipeline of new practitioners who were indoctrinated with traditional methods and Guild loyalty from an early age. Young apprentices learned not just techniques, but attitudes, absorbing the Guild's culture of professional protection and resistance to change. These apprentices emerged from their training as fully committed Guild members, prepared to defend traditional practices against any criticism and to pass the same deadly techniques on to the next generation. The Guild's social events and ceremonies reinforced professional solidarity while creating distance between practitioners and their patients. Guild banquets, processions, and religious observances emphasized the special status of barber surgeons, while treating patients as abstract problems rather than suffering human beings. This professional solidarity meant that Guild members would rarely criticize each other's practices, even when those practices were obviously harmful. Professional courtesy trumped patient welfare in every situation. The Guild's relationship with suppliers created additional opportunities for corruption and incompetence. Guild members were often required to purchase instruments and supplies from approved vendors, regardless of quality or suitability. This meant that practitioners might be forced to use inferior tools or contaminated supplies because they came from Guild-approved sources. Quality and safety were secondary to maintaining vendor relationships and Guild revenue streams. The Guild's continuing education requirements were another exercise in institutionalized ignorance. Members were required to attend lectures and demonstrations, but these focused on traditional techniques rather than new developments or improved methods. Guild education reinforced existing practices rather than challenging them. Members learned to perform traditional procedures more efficiently, rather than learning to question whether those procedures were actually effective. The Guild's ceremonial aspects added layers of ritual and mystique that obscured the reality of medical practice. Elaborate initiation ceremonies, special clothing, and formal titles created an aura of authority that had nothing to do with actual medical competence. These ceremonies served to intimidate patients, and impressed communities while providing no actual benefit to medical care. They were theatrical productions designed to enhance the Guild's prestige rather than improve patient outcomes. The Guild's international connections meant that harmful practices spread across borders and cultures. Guild members traveled between regions, carrying their techniques and traditions to new areas where local populations had no experience with their particular forms of medical incompetence. This international network ensured that medical ignorance would be standardized across Europe, preventing any region from developing significantly better practices that might expose the inadequacy of Guild methods. The Guild's legal privileges included exemptions from many forms of civil and criminal liability. Guild members could literally kill patients through gross negligence without facing legal consequences, as long as they could claim they were following traditional Guild practices. This legal immunity meant that the most dangerous practitioners faced no deterrent to their harmful behavior. They could continue practicing with complete impunity, knowing that the Guild would protect them from any consequences. The Guild's influence on medical education extended beyond their own apprenticeship programs. They often controlled access to medical texts, surgical instruments, and educational opportunities, ensuring that non-Guild practitioners would be even less qualified than Guild members. This educational monopoly meant that patients faced a choice between Guild-certified incompetence and completely untrained alternatives. There was no option for competent, independent medical care. The Guild's relationship with other medical practitioners was characterized by territorial disputes and professional jealousy, rather than cooperation or knowledge sharing. Guild barber surgeons fought to exclude physicians, midwives, and other healers from surgical practice, regardless of their relative competence. This professional warfare meant that potentially beneficial collaboration was impossible. Different types of practitioners couldn't work together to improve patient care because they were too busy defending their territorial boundaries. The Guild's financial practices included elaborate schemes for extracting money from both members and patients. Fees were structured to maximize revenue rather than provide appropriate compensation for actual services rendered. Patients might be charged for unnecessary procedures, overpriced supplies, or fictitious services that were never actually provided. The Guild's fee schedule was designed to exploit vulnerable people rather than provide fair compensation for legitimate medical care. The Guild's disciplinary hearings were conducted in secret, with no patient representation or external oversight. Guild members accused of malpractice were judged by their peers, who had every incentive to protect the reputation of the profession. These kangaroo courts rarely resulted in meaningful punishment for even the most egregious failures. Guild members might receive mild censure for procedural violations, while escaping any consequences for killing patients through incompetence. The Guild's public relations efforts focused on promoting their image as essential community servants rather than acknowledging their role in causing widespread suffering and death. Guild propaganda emphasized their dedication and expertise while ignoring their catastrophic failure rates. This image management meant that communities continued to support and trust Guild members despite overwhelming evidence of their incompetence. Public perception was shaped by Guild marketing rather than actual outcomes. The Guild's resistance to external evaluation or oversight was absolute. They refused to allow non-Guild members to observe their practices, review their outcomes, or suggest improvements to their methods. This isolation meant that Guild practices were never subjected to objective scrutiny. They operated in a closed system where criticism was impossible and improvement was actively discouraged. The Guild's legacy wasn't just the immediate harm caused by their practices. They created institutional structures and professional attitudes that would persist long after their specific techniques were abandoned. The Guild model of professional self-regulation, protection of incompetent members, and resistance to external oversight would be replicated in other fields, creating patterns of institutional dysfunction that continue to this day. The Guild system didn't just protect bad barber surgeons, it created them, nurtured them, and ensured their practices would continue indefinitely. It was a machine for converting human suffering into professional profit, wrapped in the language of tradition and sanctified by religious authority. And perhaps most terrifyingly, it worked exactly as designed. The guild system succeeded in protecting the interests of barber surgeons while completely failing to protect the interests of their patients. It was institutional incompetence elevated to the level of professional virtue. The guild didn't just enable individual acts of medical malpractice. It systematized them, standardized them, and turned them into the foundation of an entire profession. It transformed random incompetence into organized, certified, legally protected incompetence. And through it all, guild members continue to see themselves as healers, as servants of the community, as skilled professionals applying ancient wisdom to modern problems. They believed in their mission even as they systematically destroyed the lives of everyone who trusted them with their care. This wasn't malice. It was something far more dangerous: institutional delusion, protected by law, sanctified by tradition, and immune to criticism or reform. It was incompetence transformed into virtue, ignorance elevated to expertise, and harm rebranded as healing. The guild system represents the ultimate expression of medieval medical horror, not just individual practitioners who didn't know what they were doing, but an entire institutional framework designed to ensure they would never learn, never improve, and never face consequences for their failures. And that system, with its elaborate ceremonies, protective regulations, and professional solidarity, stands as perhaps the most terrifying legacy of medieval barber surgery. The proof that organized incompetence can be more dangerous than random ignorance, and that institutions designed to protect professionals rather than patients will inevitably become engines of systematic harm. But even the guild system, with all its institutional horrors, was just the framework that protected and enabled the real source of medieval medical terror: the individual practitioners themselves, armed with their crude instruments and unshakable confidence, ready to face each new day of cutting, burning, and bleeding their way through the endless parade of patients who had nowhere else to turn for help. And as dawn broke over another medieval morning, as another barber surgeon sharpened his knives and prepared his leeches, as another line of desperate patients formed outside his blood-stained shop, the cycle of horror would begin anew. Because in a world where the cure was always worse than the disease, where tradition trumped evidence, and where suffering was sanctified as healing, there was always another patient to treat, another procedure to perform, another opportunity to prove that good intentions combined with ignorance could create horrors beyond imagination. The barber surgeon would smile at his first customer of the day, wipe his hands on his already bloody apron, and reach for his favorite knife. After all, he had healing to do. The truly grotesque spectacle of medieval barber surgery reached its pinnacle not in the dramatic moments of amputation or the theatrical horror of bloodletting, but in the quiet, everyday certainty with which these practitioners approached their craft. Each morning brought fresh opportunities for mayhem disguised as medicine, and the barber surgeons met each challenge with the unwavering confidence of men who had never questioned whether their methods actually worked. Picture the scene as another medieval dawn breaks over a European town. The barber surgeon arrives at his shop, whistling perhaps, genuinely pleased to begin another day of what he considers healing work. He surveys his domain with satisfaction. The stained wooden table where yesterday's patient screamed through a tooth extraction, the collection of iron instruments still crusted with dried blood from the previous week's procedures, the bucket in the corner where he tosses the organic debris that accumulates during his daily practice. This isn't a man consumed by doubt or haunted by the memory of failed procedures. This is a craftsman proud of his trade, confident in his techniques, secure in the knowledge that he possesses skills his neighbors desperately need. He has no concept that his cure rate hovers somewhere near 0%, no understanding that patients who avoid his services often fare better than those who seek his help. The first customer of the day arrives with a complaint that would be easily treatable in any modern medical setting. A minor skin infection, perhaps, or a persistent cough that's been bothering him for a few weeks. Nothing life-threatening, nothing that couldn't be resolved with basic care and perhaps some simple medication. But we're not in a modern medical setting. We're in the workshop of a medieval barber surgeon, where minor problems become major catastrophes, and simple treatments become elaborate exercises in sanctioned torture. The examination begins with the ritual tasting of urine, that cornerstone of medieval diagnosis that never failed to provide definitive answers, regardless of how wrong those answers might be. The barber surgeon swirls the warm sample thoughtfully, takes a careful sip, and nods with the authority of a wine expert evaluating a vintage. The diagnosis comes swiftly and confidently. An excess of hot humours requiring immediate bloodletting, followed by purging to restore the natural balance. The patient's actual symptoms are secondary to what the urine has revealed. The cough might be getting better on its own. The skin infection might be responding to rest and cleanliness. But the urine doesn't lie, and the urine says blood must be drained. The patient, having no other options and no framework for questioning medical authority, submits to the prescribed treatment. He's strapped to the wooden table, his arm extended, while the barber surgeon selects his favourite lancet from a collection of instruments that haven't been properly cleaned since they were forged. The vein is opened with practiced efficiency. Blood begins to flow into a bowl that was used for the same purpose yesterday and the day before, and every day for the past month. The barber surgeon monitors the flow with the confident eye of an expert, determining by some mysterious calculus exactly how much blood needs to be drained to restore the patient's humoral balance. 2 pints flow into the bowl, then 3. The patient grows pale, then unconscious. The barber surgeon nods approvingly. This is exactly what should happen when corrupted humours are being expelled from the body. The unconsciousness is a good sign, evidence that the treatment is working exactly as intended. The wound is sealed with a red-hot iron. The unconscious patient is given to his family with instructions for care that will virtually guarantee infection, and the barber surgeon moves on to his next customer with the satisfaction of a job well done. Within a week, the patient is dead, not from his original minor infection, but from the massive blood loss and the contamination introduced during treatment. His family mourns, the community grieves, and the barber surgeon notes the death as evidence that the patient's condition was more serious than originally diagnosed. If only they had brought him in sooner, the barber surgeon reflects. If only the bloodletting had been more aggressive. If only the treatment had been started before the humoral imbalance became so severe. The failure is attributed to timing, to the patient's constitution, to divine will, to anything except the treatment itself. This cycle repeats day after day, week after week, year after year. Patients arrive with treatable conditions and leave as corpses or cripples. The barber surgeon's reputation remains intact because everyone knows that medicine is difficult, that disease is powerful, that death is common in medieval life. The barber surgeon himself never connects his treatments to the poor outcomes. He lives in a world where correlation and causation are indistinguishable, where tradition trumps observation, where confidence substitutes for competence. His patients die, but sick people always die. His treatments fail, but disease is mysterious and unpredictable. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this worldview would be impossible for a modern practitioner, but medieval barber surgeons possessed neither the knowledge nor the framework necessary to question their methods. They had been trained to perform specific procedures in specific ways, and the fact that these procedures routinely killed people was simply part of the natural order. This wasn't willful blindness or deliberate cruelty. It was systematic ignorance elevated to the level of professional virtue. The barber surgeons genuinely believed they were helping their patients, genuinely saw themselves as healers and servants of their communities. They took pride in their ability to saw through bone quickly and efficiently. They boasted about their skill at finding veins in difficult patients. They competed with each other over who could perform the most dramatic procedures or achieve the most spectacular bloodletting results. Their professional conversations focused on technique and tradition rather than outcomes. They discussed the proper angle for inserting a lancet, the correct depth for trepanation holes, the optimal timing for seasonal bloodletting. They never discussed why so many of their patients died, because patient death was simply assumed to be inevitable. The few practitioners who did begin to question traditional methods faced immediate professional and social pressure to conform. Innovation was seen as arrogance. Questioning tradition was considered impious, and suggesting that established techniques might be harmful was tantamount to professional suicide. This created a medical culture that was actively hostile to improvement, where the worst practitioners were often the most successful because they followed traditional methods most faithfully. The barber surgeons who killed the most patients were frequently the most respected members of their guilds. The economic incentives reinforced this system of sanctioned incompetence. Barber surgeons were paid for performing procedures, not for achieving successful outcomes. A practitioner who amputated unnecessarily, who bled patients to death, who performed pointless trepanations, generated more revenue than one who used conservative treatments. This perverse economic structure meant that the most dangerous practitioners were also the most profitable. They could afford better shops, finer instruments, more elaborate advertising. Their success attracted more patients who became victims of their increasingly confident incompetence. The religious framework of medieval society provided additional protection for these deadly practitioners. Suffering was considered spiritually beneficial, death was seen as God's will, and questioning medical authority was tantamount to questioning divine providence. Patients were encouraged to accept their suffering as penance for their sins, to view their pain as an opportunity for spiritual growth, to submit to medical procedures as an act of faith. This theological framework made it impossible for patients to advocate for gentler treatment or question aggressive procedures. The barber surgeons themselves were protected by this religious umbrella. They saw their work as carrying out God's will, their procedures as spiritual as well as medical interventions. The pain they inflicted was sanctified, the deaths they caused were predetermined, the suffering they created was redemptive. This combination of economic incentives, professional protection, religious sanction, and genuine ignorance created a medical system that was optimized for harm rather than healing. It wasn't designed to cure patients, it was designed to provide the appearance of medical intervention while protecting practitioners from the consequences of their failures. The barber surgeons who thrived in this system weren't necessarily evil or sadistic. They were products of their environment, trained from childhood to accept traditional methods without question, rewarded for conformity rather than competence, protected from criticism by institutional structures that prioritize professional solidarity over patient welfare. They lived their entire careers without ever receiving honest feedback about their work. Patients either recovered, died, or disappeared, but their outcomes were never systematically tracked or analyzed. The barber surgeons had no way of knowing whether their treatments were effective because effectiveness was never measured. This isolation from consequences created a professional bubble where practitioners could maintain complete confidence in their methods, regardless of how catastrophically those methods failed. They developed elaborate explanations for poor outcomes that never implicated their own techniques or competence. When patients died, it was because their conditions were too advanced, their constitutions too weak, their spiritual state too corrupted. When treatments failed, it was because the procedures weren't aggressive enough, the timing wasn't optimal, the patient wasn't sufficiently compliant. The barber surgeons created a comprehensive mythology around their practice. that explained every failure while protecting their core beliefs about the effectiveness of their methods. This mythology was so complete and internally consistent that it became impossible to challenge from within the profession. New practitioners were indoctrinated with this mythology from the beginning of their training. They learned not just techniques, but explanatory frameworks, absorbing not just skills, but attitudes. By the time they became independent practitioners, they were psychologically incapable of questioning the system that had shaped them. The apprenticeship system ensured that this cycle of ignorance would continue indefinitely. Each generation of barber surgeons trained the next in exactly the same methods, with exactly the same confidence, with exactly the same blindness to their own failures. Innovation was not just discouraged, it was literally impossible within this system. Practitioners who tried to develop better methods were expelled from the profession, while those who faithfully repeated traditional techniques were rewarded with success and status. The guild system provided institutional protection for this cycle of incompetence. Guild members were shielded from criticism, protected from competition, insulated from the consequences of their failures. They could maintain terrible success rates without losing customers because customers had no alternatives. The legal system reinforced these protections by granting barber surgeons immunity from most forms of civil and criminal liability. They could literally kill patients through gross negligence without facing legal consequences, as long as they could claim they were following traditional guild practices. This legal immunity created a moral hazard where the worst practitioners faced no deterrent to their harmful behavior. They could continue practicing with complete impunity, knowing that the guild and the legal system would protect them from any consequences. The social status of barber surgeons reflected this institutional protection. Despite their terrible success rates, they were often respected members of their communities, valued for their willingness to provide medical services, even when those services were more harmful than helpful. Communities that should have run these practitioners out of town instead honored them as essential public servants. The social need for medical authority was so strong that people preferred incompetent practitioners to no practitioners at all. This social protection meant that barber surgeons could maintain their positions even when their failures were obvious to everyone around them. Communities would rather have deadly medical care than admit they had no effective medical care at all. The international nature of the guild system meant that these problems were not localized but universal. Barber surgeons trained in one region could practice in any other region, carrying their deadly techniques across borders and cultures. This created a standardized system of medical incompetence that spanned the entire European continent. There was no escape from barber surgery, no region where significantly better medical practices had developed, no alternative model that communities could adopt. The universality of the system made it seem natural and inevitable. When the same medical practices existed everywhere, when every community had similar practitioners using similar methods with similar results, it became impossible to imagine that things could be different. The barber surgeons themselves traveled frequently, attending guild meetings, participating in religious festivals, serving military campaigns. This mobility reinforced the standardization of practices while preventing any local innovation from taking root. The economic structure of medieval society meant that medical innovation required significant investment in training, equipment, and research. Only the wealthy could afford to experiment with new approaches, and the wealthy already had access to university-trained physicians. This meant that innovation, when it occurred, was confined to the treatment of elite patients, while the common people continued to receive the same deadly care from the same incompetent practitioners. The few medical advances that did emerge during the medieval period came primarily from Islamic scholars, Jewish physicians, or university-trained doctors who had access to classical texts and philosophical frameworks that encouraged observation and experimentation. But these advances rarely filtered down to the level of practical surgery or everyday medical care. The barber surgeons, who treated most of the population, remained isolated from intellectual developments, continuing to practice according to traditions that had been obsolete for centuries. The translation of classical medical texts into Latin during the later medieval period provided new theoretical frameworks for understanding disease and treatment. But these translations rarely reached practicing barber surgeons, who couldn't read Latin and had no access to expensive manuscript collections. Even when new ideas did reach practical practitioners, they were usually filtered through the lens of existing beliefs and traditions. Revolutionary concepts were domesticated, radical innovations were neutered, and potentially beneficial changes were rejected if they conflicted with established practices. The institutional structure of medieval medicine was designed to resist change rather than embrace it. Every innovation threatened existing power structures, challenged established authorities, and potentially exposed the inadequacy of traditional methods. The guilds, the churches, the legal systems, and the social hierarchies of medieval Europe all had vested interests in maintaining the status quo. They provided multiple layers of protection for existing practices while creating barriers to any meaningful reform. This institutional resistance to change meant that medical progress, when it occurred, was glacially slow and often reversed by subsequent generations who preferred traditional methods to new approaches. The barber surgeons who practiced within this system were not evil conspirators seeking to harm their patients. They were ordinary people trying to make a living while providing what they genuinely believed were essential services to their communities. They were trapped within institutional structures that made competence impossible and improvement unthinkable. They were products of a system that valued tradition over effectiveness, authority over evidence, and professional solidarity over patient welfare. The true horror of medieval barber surgery wasn't the individual acts of incompetence or cruelty. It was the systematic, institutional nature of the failure. It was a comprehensive system designed to ensure that medical practice would remain dangerous, that practitioners would remain ignorant, and that patients would continue to suffer and die from treatments that were supposed to heal them. This system didn't fail by accident. It succeeded exactly as it was designed to succeed. It protected the interests of practitioners while completely failing to protect the interests of patients. It provided the appearance of medical care while ensuring that actual healing remained as elusive as ever. The legacy of this system extends far beyond the medieval period. The institutional structures, professional attitudes, and protective mechanisms developed by medieval barber surgeons would influence medical practice for centuries to come. The guild model of professional self-regulation, the resistance to external oversight, the protection of incompetent practitioners, the prioritization of professional interests over patient welfare, all of these would reappear in various forms throughout the subsequent history of medicine. Even today, we can see echoes of medieval barber surgery in medical systems that prioritize professional autonomy over accountability, that resist transparency and external evaluation, that protect practitioners from the consequences of their failures. The barber surgeons are long gone, their crude instruments relegated to museums, their deadly techniques abandoned for more effective approaches. But the institutional logic that protected and enabled them, the professional culture that valued solidarity over competence, the social structures that prioritized authority over evidence, these have proved more durable than the specific practices they were designed to protect. The medieval barber surgeon, standing in his blood-stained apron with his collection of rusty instruments, represents more than just a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale about the dangers of medical ignorance. He represents the eternal human capacity for self-deception, the ability to transform harm into healing through the simple expedient of believing our own propaganda. He reminds us that good intentions are not enough, that professional training without intellectual honesty is worthless, that institutional protection without accountability is dangerous, and that the combination of authority and ignorance can create horrors that persist for centuries. The barber surgeon believed he was a healer. His patients believed he was a healer. His community believed he was a healer. The guilds, the churches, and the legal systems all supported this belief. And yet, despite this universal consensus, despite this institutional support, despite this absolute certainty, he remained what he had always been: a butcher with a medical license, a killer with professional credentials, a practitioner whose cure was invariably worse than any disease. And perhaps that is the most terrifying lesson of all: that consensus doesn't create truth, that authority doesn't guarantee competence, and that the most dangerous practitioners are often those who are most certain of their own righteousness. The medieval barber surgeon stands as a monument to the dangers of unexamined confidence, institutional protection, and the human capacity for believing what we need to believe rather than what the evidence actually shows. He practiced his deadly craft with complete conviction, protected by powerful institutions, supported by respected traditions, and shielded from the consequences of his failures. And in doing so, he created a legacy of suffering that would echo through the centuries. A reminder that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with professional credentials, institutional support, and the unshakable belief that tradition is more important than truth. The barber surgeon's blade has long since rusted away, but the lesson it teaches remains as sharp as ever. That in the absence of accountability, humility, and honest evaluation, even the most well-intentioned practitioners can become instruments of systematic harm. And that lesson, carved in the bones of countless medieval patients, written in the blood that stained countless barbershops, echoes through the halls of every medical institution that has ever prioritized its own protection over the welfare of those it claims to serve. The medieval barber surgeon is dead, but his ghost still walks among us, disguised in modern clothing, speaking in contemporary language, but carrying the same deadly combination of authority and ignorance, confidence and incompetence, good intentions and catastrophic results that made him the most terrifying medical practitioner in human history. Because the tools change, the techniques evolve, the institutions modernize, but the fundamental human capacity for self-deception, for institutional protection of failure, for the transformation of harm into healing through the simple act of believing our own stories, that remains as constant as the sunrise, as predictable as the seasons, and as dangerous today as it was when the first barber surgeon picked up his knife and convinced himself he was saving lives while systematically destroying them. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the blood-soaked, guild-protected, institutionally sanctified nightmare that was medieval barber surgery. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, at least we've moved past all that, I have some uncomfortable news for you. The barber surgeon may be gone, but his DNA lives on in every system that protects incompetence, every institution that values tradition over evidence, every profession that shields its members from accountability while claiming to serve the public good. You see, the real horror of medieval barber surgery wasn't just the crude instruments or the primitive techniques, or even the staggering death rates. It was the system. The beautiful, self-protecting, self-perpetuating system that transformed individual ignorance into institutional virtue, that turned personal failure into professional success, that made harm profitable and healing irrelevant. That system didn't die with the last barber surgeon. It evolved. It adapted. It learned new languages, adopted new technologies, developed more sophisticated forms of protection, but at its core, it remained the same, a machine for converting human suffering into professional profit, while maintaining the appearance of service and expertise. The guild system that protected medieval barber surgeons has been replicated in countless forms throughout history. Professional associations that prioritize member protection over public welfare. licensing systems that create artificial scarcity while providing no meaningful quality control, regulatory frameworks that shield practitioners from accountability while creating barriers for innovation. The religious justification for medieval medical torture has been replaced by scientific-sounding rhetoric, but the function remains the same: to provide moral cover for practices that harm rather than heal, to sanctify suffering in the name of greater goods that never seem to materialize. The apprenticeship system that transmitted ignorance from generation to generation has been replaced by educational institutions that often function the same way, teaching students not to question authority, not to challenge tradition, not to measure results against intentions. The territorial monopolies that gave medieval barber surgeons captive patient populations have been replicated in countless modern forms, creating situations where people have no choice but to accept incompetent service because alternatives have been legally eliminated or practically impossible. The medieval barber surgeon's confidence in his methods, his certainty that tradition justified any outcome, his ability to explain away every failure while maintaining absolute faith in his approach, these psychological patterns persist wherever institutional protection meets professional authority. Look around you. Listen to the explanations offered when systems fail, when institutions harm the people they claim to serve, when professional expertise produces results that are worse than random chance. Notice how often the response is to double down on existing methods rather than question fundamental assumptions. Notice how often failure is attributed to external factors, insufficient resources, inadequate compliance, or the complexity of the problems being addressed. Notice how rarely the response is to question whether the basic approach might be wrong, whether the experts might be ignorant, whether the institutions might be optimized for the wrong outcomes. The medieval barber surgeon's greatest achievement wasn't his surgical techniques or his medical knowledge. It was his ability to create a system that made competence irrelevant, accountability impossible, and improvement unthinkable. And that system, in various forms, continues to shape our world today. We still live in a world where professional credentials matter more than actual results, where institutional authority trumps empirical evidence, where the appearance of expertise is valued over the reality of competence. We still live in a world where systems protect themselves rather than the people they claim to serve, where failure is rewarded if it follows proper procedures, where innovation is discouraged if it threatens existing power structures. The barber surgeon's blade may have been crude, his techniques primitive, his knowledge laughably inadequate, but his institutional legacy is sophisticated, elegant, and devastatingly effective at protecting failure while punishing success. And perhaps that's the most terrifying lesson of all, that the medieval barber surgeon wasn't an aberration or an accident. He was the logical product of systems designed to protect practitioners rather than patients, to preserve tradition rather than pursue truth, to maintain authority rather than achieve results. Those systems are still with us. They've evolved, they've modernized, they've learned to speak in contemporary languages and adopt fashionable causes. But at their core, they remain what they always were: machines for converting public trust into private benefit, for transforming social authority into personal protection, for turning the rhetoric of service into the reality of exploitation. The medieval barber surgeon is dead. Long live the medieval barber surgeon. Because as long as we have institutions that protect incompetence, professions that shield failure, and systems that prioritize authority over evidence, his spirit will live on. Every time someone dies from a treatment that was supposed to heal them, every time a system fails the people it was designed to serve, every time institutional protection trumps individual accountability, the medieval barber surgeon smiles from his grave. He wasn't just a doctor with a bad technique. He was the architect of a way of thinking about authority, expertise, and accountability that continues to shape our world. His legacy isn't measured in the lives he took, but in the systems he helped create to ensure that taking lives would never have consequences. And until we learn to recognize those systems, to challenge those assumptions, to demand accountability over authority and results over credentials, we will continue to live in his world. A world where the cure is always worse than the disease, where help is indistinguishable from harm, and where the most dangerous people are those who are most certain they're helping. The barber surgeon's shop may be closed, but his business model lives on. And somewhere, in some institution, in some profession, in some system designed to help people, his ghost is still working, still cutting, still bleeding patients dry while collecting payment for the privilege. Because that's what systems do when they're designed to protect themselves rather than serve others. They create endless generations of practitioners who believe they're healers while systematically destroying everything they touch. The medieval barber surgeon wasn't a monster. He was something far more dangerous, a true believer in a system that made monsters inevitable. And until we learn to recognize the difference between service and self-service, between healing and harm, between help and exploitation, his legacy will continue to shape our world. The blade may be dull, but the lesson remains sharp, and the patient is still bleeding.